Tony Hawk will go down in history as one of the most well-known skateboarders to have ever lived. For more than 3 decades, he's represented skateboarding in the media, invented many of the tricks that skateboarders still use, and his video game series completely altered the course of skateboarding culture. However, while many know Tony Hawk for his success, few are aware of the struggles he overcame to become what he is today. This video is dedicated to Tony Hawk. He was a normal kid born back in 1968. His older brother introduced him to skateboarding soon before the rest of his older siblings moved out. He had several older brothers and sisters, but due to his age, the majority of them had left the family by the time he was a toddler, thus making him an only child. His brother was a surfer, and he was the one who introduced him to skating. He said that he would drive Tony to the park, and that's when his passion began. Fortunately for him, growing up in San Diego in the 1970s, he was practically in the center of skateboarding from the start. Tony resolved to spend as much time as possible skateboarding. He had incredibly high standards and a self-critical temperament that was borderline toxic. Everyone around him didn't understand his obsession, yet it was precisely this that allowed him to develop as a frail little lad. Tony, who failed in more traditional sports, didn't let his eyesight problem stop him from skating and even used it to his advantage. He had to be creative in order to pull off several tricks which inspired many of the innovations for which he is today famous. Because he spent all of his free time skating, it didn't take long for him to improve. He began competing when he was just 11 years old. Tony Hawk was already a pro at the age of 12, but by the age of 14 he was competing at the highest level. Tony eventually secured a seat on the new iconic Bones Brigade, which was a fresh new squad composed of all top skaters at the time. The bulk of skateboarding feats that are still performed today were pioneered by members of the Bones Brigade. They also released some of the first skate videos. Those days, you might not even think releasing a skate video is that monumental, and honestly, people back then didn't either. Even the skaters on the team considered as some annoying endeavor they just had to do. However, these goofy little movies would totally change the face of skate culture. They were only meant to sell a few hundred copies, but ended up selling tens of thousands as one of the team's major members, propelling Tony even further into the spotlight. Meanwhile, he was competing in every imaginable contest and, for the most part, doing well. This was a time when new tricks were being devised left, right, and Tony was a big contributor. The competition and the videos meant he was in a great position. It was the right time because skateboarding was experiencing a renaissance, and Tony was at the forefront, winning tons of contests and landing roles in some of the first ever skateboarding movies, which only helped him get even larger royalties from his skate sponsors. Skateboarding was a major trend that was ideal for the late 1980s, and because Tony was one of the greatest skateboarders around, he was a senior in high school earning roughly $160,000 a year. Most of it went to parties like how a teen would spend his fortune. He lived in Southern California, and out of everything he bought, one of the few Bible things he owned was a house that his father persuaded him to buy when he was still in high school. Because Tony was so young, spending money didn't seem like a big deal, but as he would soon learn, the good times would only last so long. See, the thing about trends is that they grow exponentially before eventually dying out. As one of the biggest trends of the 1980s, skateboarding was an evergreen. The majority of skateboarders do not have backup plans. Many of them don't even have a high school diploma. Skateboarding is a young person's game, so if you want to be one of the best, you have to devote yourself to it at a young age. But what if skateboarding doesn't work out? How do you make a living when all you know is skateboarding? These were pressing issues that many pros, including Tony Hawk, faced at the time. After a surge in the mid to late 1980s, skateboarding saw a collapse in the early 1990s. Not only was the skate industry dwindling, but street skating was beginning to take over vert skating, which was pretty much the only sort of skating Tony did. Skateboarding as a whole was going out, and Tony's discipline within skating was dying out even faster, month after month. Tony spent the majority of his childhood skateboarding. The amount of passion Tony had for skateboarding was divine, but when the trend began to die, he didn't have anything else to turn to. But he also didn't want anything else to turn to. All he knew and cared about was skating, and he was determined to find a way to skate by whatever means necessary. He suffered for about 4 years from 92 to 96, trying to support a family as a skater was really difficult. Tony was in his mid-20s, had just had his first child, and couldn't afford to pay his bills. This was when he made a very risky decision that very few people would make. He actually owned 2 houses. With his income drying up, he realized he wouldn't be able to pay for both. He sold his newer house, moved his family into his old house, and used the additional money to start Birdhouse Skateboards. By creating his own board company, he could still make money skating and be engaged in skating, even though the industry wasn't as huge and no one wanted to watch this type of skating. By 1995 and 96, there were serious discussions about closing the business permanently, but after a few dark years, Tony's career in skateboarding were about to come out on the other side. At the extreme games, you become the all-time champion. Some trends just make sense for particular eras. For example, skateboarding first gained popularity in the late 1960s because it was appropriate for that era. The public was prepared for skateboarding once more in 1995 by the late 1990s. In its first summer extreme games, ESPN showcased a ton of bizarre extreme sports that most people had never even heard of, like barefoot water ski jumping, sky surfing, bungee leaping, and a variety of other random activities. Skateboarding was one of the random extreme sports that was featured because it was something the public was already familiar with in the past, and it ended up being one of the most popular events over the following few years. The extreme games would eventually be transformed into the X Games. Sports were all broadcast in mainstream competition for the first time ever. The X Games helped bring skateboarding back into the public eye. Birdhouse skateboards finally started to grow, and Tony's individual skate career also started to do well again. Then in 1998, they decided to focus on the things that got the best reception, and they dropped a lot of the strange sports that no one had ever heard of. Fortunately for Tony, this included skateboarding and bird skating as well. The first ever landing of a 900 by Tony Hawk has since become one of the most famous moments in skateboarding history. It was a trick he had been practicing for over 10 years. By landing it on television for the first time, the significance of the trick and the fervor of the crowd reached a wider audience simultaneously. At the same time, he was also developing a small video game called Tony Hawk's Pro Skater. Due to the fact that skateboarding was expanding quickly, and Tony had a lot of buzz surrounding him, as many of you may know, the timing of its release was absolutely ideal. The game ended up selling millions of copies and inspiring dozens of sequels. In the early 2000s, Tony Hawk's Pro Skater video game series served as the catalyst for an explosion in skateboarding's popularity. The Tony Hawk Pro Skater video games are renowned for having some of the biggest sales and soundtracks in video game history due to their popularity of the games. It also contributed to defining the musical tastes of an entire generation. Tony Hawk gained widespread recognition and received several endorsements and sponsorships from every imaginable type of corporation. As a result, he went from struggling to pay his bills in the mid-1990s to earning millions of dollars in the mid-2000s. Since its creation, the Skate Park project has helped fund over 900 skate parks and has distributed close to $10 million. Tony Hawk created the Skate Park project in 2002 to assist build skate parks in underprivileged regions. Tony soon began to scale back his competitive career, but he continued to work on many interesting side projects. He's participated in numerous skating competitions with a loop, created the first ever sideways loop, and released a number of film parts. He released a video of doing 50 different feats at the age of 50. At the age of 48, he was still able to perform a 900 on an inclined ramp. Thank you so much for watching.